Hello, I am your professor, Dr. Vance, and I just wanted to go over kind of how to read a primary source. I know you've done several already, but I just wanted to walk through a few things with you guys today. And so I'm going to use the primary source readings from chapter 4. So if you've already done this, which you should, great. If you want to update it, fine. I know that not everybody has the right sources in their textbook, so I'm trying to type those in case you wonder. No, I cannot copy and paste because this is copyrighted and it won't let me. So, great. Anyway, the source for chapter 4 is Robert Califf, excerpts from More Wonders of the Invisible World, which was written in 1700. So, as a student of history, I would also look at the primary source questions before I began to read the document, just so I can see what sort of things I need to keep an eye out for as I'm reading it. And usually it requires you to read the document more than once. So here are our questions. What aspects of this document may have caused Cotton Mather to burn it? Well, this is interesting, okay? And it's also interesting because when you look right here in this paragraph, this says increase Mather. Cotton Mather, I believe, is Increase Mather's father. And then second, what is the author's opinion of the leaders of the colony and those that presided over the trials? I should have changed that to those who presided over the trials, because you use who and whom with human beings, but that's okay. All right. So at the beginning of every source, and I've got this highlighted, the entire excerpt here, you will see that there is a brief synopsis of the background of the source. So here we have a brief synopsis of the background. So we have the witch hunts of 1692 in the colony of Massachusetts, and you know them probably best as the Salem witch trials. And then you see here that it says some colonists wrote about the experience, some other people collected people's lived experiences, their testimonies, part of oral history regarding the events that occurred during the Salem witch trials. Now, then we learn who Robert Califf is, who wrote this source. Robert Califf was a Boston merchant, and he wrote a manuscript or book, and he sent it back to London in 1697. It was published in London, and then when it came back to the colonies, we can see that it was not too popular up in Boston because the Puritan minister Increase Mather had copies burned in Harvard Yard. Yes, that's the Harvard you are familiar with. So then it's going to start with the source itself, okay? So let's read this together. And I don't know, every once in a while my recording is like doing a little circle thing, but that's okay. On May 24th, 1692, a woman is accused of witchcraft, and her name is Mrs. Carey, obviously, and she's from Charlestown, Massachusetts. And it says here she was examined and committed. Now, what examined and committed means in 2022 is not what it meant in 1697. So the words are the same, but the meanings change sometimes. And so what you have here is that this is basically going to be the testimony of Mrs. Carey's husband, who is Mr. Nathaniel Kerry. So if we start this source, all right, so if we start this source, this is from the viewpoint. That's why reading the background material is so important, including that very top part there, because this is the testimony or the first person experience of Mr. Nathaniel Kerry, right? Not the wife, but the wife's husband. So he's saying here, I heard around town, right, for several days that my wife was going to be accused of witchcraft. And of course, as her husband, he is, quote, much disturbed at it. And then he talked to some people, what should I do? And they're like, well, we need to go to Salem Village to see if those who are afflicted by the witch, so to speak, actually knew his wife or not. So they go to Salem. It's the 24th of May, and it happened to be the day appointed for examination. Okay, now this is not like going to a doctor's office or having a final exam, although there are a little bit of similarities there. So soon after their arrival, with Mr. and then we have Mr. Hawthorne and Mr. Corwin. Everybody goes to the meeting house, okay, which is the place appointed for that examination. And that is basically the church house, okay, the place where church members meet. It's interesting. The minister starts with a prayer, and then, having cared to get to a convenient place in the prayer, this guy notices, Mr. Carey, that the afflicted were about two girls of around 10 years of age and about two or three other women of about 18. Now, one of the girls talked the most and could discern more than the rest. So that means perhaps she is the ringleader. The prisoners were cavalled in one by one, and as they came in were cried out of, etc. Now, this is a strange sentence, right? Well, fortunately, down here we have some notes, okay? So we look at note 13. Those accused of witchcraft were jeered at, yelled at. Okay, so this is not a pleasant experience for these women. Okay, so we go back up. Hopefully my computer is going to cooperate with me. Okay, so we go back up, and these poor women are coming into this meeting house, which is the church. Let's see where we were. All right, we come into the meeting. The prisoner was placed about 7 or 8 feet from the justices. It's like the space of a tall man at a foot or so. And the accusers, which means the young girls, between the justices and them. Okay, so the prisoner is basically put between the justices and the girls who are accusing them of being witches. The prisoner is ordered to stand right before the judges, with an officer of the court appointed to hold each hand of that poor woman, lest they should therewith afflict them. Well, what does that mean? Well, they're holding the witch's hands, and I use witch very loosely here because clearly these women are not witches, okay? So they have to hold the women's hands to make sure that those women do not do further witchcraft on the children. And the prisoner's eyes must be constantly on the justices. Again, because I guess in their idea, a witch could use her hands or her eyes to hurt people. Because if these women who are accused of witchcraft looked on these girls, they would either fall into the fits, the girls would, or cry out of being hurt by them. And clearly that's an issue for these women who are being accused, these prisoners. All right. Now, they needed to say the Lord's Prayer as a trial of their guilt. Okay? That is, everyone's going to say the Lord's Prayer to try to make sure that the witches, these women, cannot be powerful, right? And if you grew up in the church, you probably know it off the top of your head. Many people don't, so nowadays, but back then everyone would have known this prayer from the time they are very, very small. So we see here, after the Lord's Prayer has been said, that the young girls seem to come out of their fits, that they would look just fine on some one person. That is, they would stare at somebody and not speak, and then the justices would say, oh, they've been struck dumb. And then, that is, that the witches were attacking them and they couldn't speak. But then after a little while, the girls would speak again. And then the justices would say to the accusers, which of you will go and touch the prisoner at the bar? Which seems a very strange way of having a criminal proceeding. But clearly, these are strange times. So the most courageous would adventure, that is, they would try, right? The most courageous of them would try to go touch the prisoner. But before they made it 3 steps, they would fall down in a fit. And so the justices ordered that they should be taken up and carried to the prisoner, right? So, in other words, just imagine this scene. Here are these poor women being held by their hands, forced to look straight at the justices, while these young girls are like swooning and acting crazy and going into these fits, saying that you are the one doing it, right? As this woman. And then they're supposed to come and try to touch you, and they fall down because I guess, they're supposed to be being attacked. And then they would say, okay, we're going to carry you to the prisoner, let the prisoner touch the girls, and as soon as the girls were touched, or as soon as the prisoner, rather, was touched by the accused, the justices would say, well, before the speaker himself could see any change, could see anything happening, this man's husband would say, the justices would say, well, we have understood what is going on, understood the manner of it. And this man is like, what in the world is going on, right? And the husband of this woman who is going to be accused. So he's like, well, I was just a spectator, but my wife's also there part of the time. No one was paying any attention to her, except once or twice they came to her and they asked her name. Now, this is important, right? So these little girls, they don't appear to actually know Mrs. Carey, so they're completely ignoring her. Except a couple of them go over to her and have a nice little conversation and say, oh, what is your name? Which really young girls back then shouldn't have asked older women, but okay. So Mr. Kerry has talked with Mr. Hale, whom he had known, and he took Mr. Hale's advice about what to do. And he decided Mr. Kerry would like to speak with those girls who were accusing his wife. Okay? Mr. Hale says, oh yeah, I'll take care of this for you, which he promised should be. It's old-fashioned way of saying that. And then Mr. Kerry says, okay, I'm going to tell you what's going on. And Mr. Kerry says, I reposed my trust in him. In other words, I trusted him. Thought this guy was going to help me. So Mr. Hale comes to Mr. Kerry after the examination is over and tells me, okay, now I have the chance to speak with the accuser, who is Abigail Williams, a girl of 11 or 12 years old. But he's not allowed to speak to Abigail. Not that he would speak to her alone or even with a small group of people or like a chaperone. No, It could not be in private at Mr. Parris's house, as Mr. Hale had promised Mr. Carey. That's not going to happen, so Mr. Hale's already broken some of his promise. So that we went into an alehouse, of all places, where an Indian man attended us who also was afflicted by witchcraft. We gave this Indian man some cider, and he showed us a bunch of scars that looked to Mr. Kerry as though they had been there a long time, and said that these wounds, which have healed over, obviously, were done by witchcraft. And said that his wife, the Indian man's wife, was imprisoned for witchcraft. Okay? And you'll notice here too this important sentence, who also was a slave. That means that the Indian man and his wife are both enslaved. It's important to realize in these colonies, right, in the North, in New England, we often think, oh, they didn't have slavery. No, they had slavery. Native Americans who survived the smallpox epidemic, the violence, were often kidnapped and enslaved by the colonial people. Here we have a first person interaction in this colonial culture with Native American people who are enslaved. And so, instead of just Abigail Williams coming in with her parents, all of the young girls who claim to be affected by witchcraft come into this alehouse, and then you will notice Mr. Carey says, they all began to tumble down like swine. Now, this is an insult, okay? And then there were 3 women who were called in to take care of these young girls. Everybody in the room is just standing there, horrified and petrified, because they're going to wait and see who these girls, it says here, they would cry out of. That's a strange way of putting it, right? Remember, this is 1697. So, in other words, who are these girls going to stand here and accuse of witchcraft in the alehouse? So they're all standing there, bated breath, waiting to see. But in a short time, they did cry out. And what do they say? Kerry. That is the last name of his wife. And immediately, a warrant was sent from the justices to bring his poor wife before them. Now, these justices were sitting in a chamber nearby, waiting to hear who the girls would accuse. You're seeing how messed up this is, right? So let's follow this logically. These young girls did not know Mrs. Carey's name in the courtroom. She was there in the courtroom as an accused witch. So they go up to Mrs. Carey and they're like, hey, what's your name? Right? Mrs. Carey tells them. So then the girls come to this alehouse where they have a meeting with Mr. Carey, who wants to ask them in a private setting, or really just Abigail Williams, how do you know my wife? In other words, I think he wants to interrogate the young girl to figure out, he knows there's no way this young girl could have known his wife, right? Instead, it all goes wrong. Mr. Hale betrays Mr. Carey, and what you have is a full-blown version of these young girls being afflicted by witches and then crying out who they were, who the witch was that was hurting them. All right, so what's going to happen to Mrs. Carey? Well, she's brought before the justices. Who are her chief accusers? 2 girls. His wife says, I don't know these girls. I've never seen them before this day. But his wife is still forced to stand with her arms stretched out. Her husband is like, can I hold one of her hands? But the justices are like, no, right? It says here, I did request that I might hold one of her hands, but it was denied me. She then desired me to wipe the tears from her eyes and the sweat from her face, which I did. Then she desired that she might lean herself upon me. She might lean herself on me, saying she should faint, right? So her husband's there giving her the support that he can. He's not allowed to hold one of her hands. But you can also see here, Mrs. Carey is having a hard time of it, right? Mrs. Carey is quite upset because if you are accused of witchcraft, it's bad thing, right? You usually end up dead, in prison or dead. Now, remember what we just said, right? The poor wife is so upset she's about to fall down in a faint, and she wants to lean against her husband. So, how is the court going to respond? The justice says, if you have enough strength to torment these young women, right, then you should have enough strength to stand. Oh, the irony! The justice has already decided that she's guilty. Clearly, this is not how the American court system in the future is supposed to work. Remember, this is still a colonial America. Really, this is a Puritan court system. This is why we have a separation of church and state. This is bad. Okay? Now, of course, the husband says, I start speaking against their cruel proceedings. And what do they tell the husband? They say, they commanded me to be silent, or else I should be turned out of the room. So basically, you shut up or you're out of here. The Indian then that was in the alehouse, he was brought in, and now he's going to be one of the accusers of Mrs. Carey. And then, of course, he falls down as well, and he tumbles around like a hog. So here we have Mr. Kerry comparing both the girls and the Native American man to pigs. Again, this is not a compliment. The justices asked the girls, who afflicted the Indian? They answered, she, meaning my wife, and they lay upon him. The justices ordered Mrs. Carey to touch the Native American. I know sometimes they're not very good telling you exactly who the pronouns stand for, but that's what it means. In order to cure him, but her head must be turned another way, lest instead of curing him, she should make him worse because she looked at him. So she's got her head turned the other way, probably her eyes squeezed shut, and her hand was guided to take hold of his, right? Now, women back then did not touch strange men, especially in Puritan society, and men did not touch women like that. I mean, husbands and wives barely touched each other, okay? So her hand is being guided to touch the Indian, and the Native American guide takes hold of her hand and pulls her down on the floor. Now, this is just shocking, okay? And then, of course, in order to emphasize this, Mr. Kerry is going to say, in a barbarous manner. Then his hand was taken off, and her hand was put on his, and the cure was quickly wrought, right? Now, the fact that he's using the word barbarous here, although he's going to use this later on, not just for a Native American, also indicates the weight of words. Native Americans were often seen as uncivilized back then and barbarous. So, supposedly, now that the wife has touched the Native American, he's all fixed. So strange, if you think about it. Now, the husband is going to give you some of his feelings, and he says, I, being extremely troubled at their inhumane dealings, uttered a hasty speech. Basically, he said that God would take vengeance on them and desired that God would deliver us out of the hands of unmerciful men. Right? The husband seeing the writing on the wall. This looks bad for his wife. So he says, Lord, have mercy. Okay? And he's being very critical of these justices, these young women, the court, the men of the church in Salem. Then her mittimus was writ, that is, to put her in jail. I did with difficulty and charge obtain the liberty of a room, but no beds in it. That is, he fought hard to get her at least a room, but there were no beds. Even if there had been, her husband says, she could have taken but little rest that night. In other words, she wouldn't have slept much anyway. She was committed to a prison in Boston, but this husband obtained a habeas corpus to remove her to Cambridge prison, which is in their county of Middlesex. So, having been there one night, she's moved, right? And how are they going to move her? They put irons on her legs. The jailer is commanded to do this. The weight of them was about 8 pounds, which is quite heavy for irons on your legs. So, what happens to his wife? He says, these irons and her other afflictions soon brought her into convulsion fits, so that I thought she would have died that night. Okay. So, what does he do next? I am sent to entreat that the irons might be taken off. That is, entreat. He asked, he begged. But all entreaties were in vain. They're not going to let her out of these heavy, like, chains. Okay. Even if it would have saved her life. And so in this condition, she must continue. Now, the husband knows that the trials of Salem are coming up. He goes there to see how things are managed, and he finds that the specter evidence there received, together with idle, if not malicious, stories against people's lives, that's it. What he, in other words, he's saying is just full of lies and drama. After witnessing that spectacle, he realizes, right, I did easily perceive which way the rest would go. That is, he figured it out pretty quickly, exactly how these trials are going to go for each person. For the same evidence that served for one would serve for all the rest. So this evidence that basically it's these young girls and this Native Americans' word against these older women are being taken as truth. The women accused of witchcraft, and men will be too, are going to be condemned, regardless of any defense they put forth. The husband realizes this. He's a smart guy. So he tells his wife, look, you are in serious trouble, regardless of your innocence. I acquainted her with her danger, and that if she were carried to Salem to be tried to go to court, her husband feared that she would never return. He's right. So the husband says, I did my utmost that she might have her trial in her own county. So he's going to try to get her moved to the county that she's from, where people know her and know she's not a witch. He, with several others, asked the judge in order to get her trial moved to a different county. And they were hopeful about it, right? And were put in hopes of it. But I soon saw so much that I understood thereby it was not intended. That means they're not going to allow his wife to be tried in another county, which put me upon consulting the means of her escape. So now he's got to figure out how to help her escape, which through the goodness of God, he's saying, right? Lots of God talk in these early documents, was affected, and she got to Rhode Island. That is, they effected an escape for her. She escapes to Rhode Island, but soon found herself not safe when there, by reason of the pursuit after her. That is, she's on the lam. They are in hot pursuit. And from thence, that is Rhode Island, she went to New York, along with some others that had escaped their cruel hands. Whose cruel hands? Well, the accusers, the justices, the Puritans in Salem. where we found His Excellency Benjamin Fletcher, Esquire, Governor, who was very courteous to us. So the New York governor's like, oh, dude, yeah, you can come here. That sounds terrible. After some of my goods were seized in a friend's hands with whom I had left them, right? He knows this is bad. He gives a friend of his some of his worldly possessions. The justices can't come and take them, right? His wealth. And he himself is imprisoned by the sheriff and kept in jail half a day. Then he was let go and then dismissed. So he's going to talk about how the jail is treating all the prisoners. Right now, he has firsthand experience. He was only there half a day. But to speak of their usage, who's there, right? Well, the people keeping the prisons, and the Puritans, the church elders, and the justices, speak of their usage of the prisoners and their inhumanity shown to them at the time of their execution. Okay? That is, he's seeing these people being accused of witchcraft being put to the death. And they are treated very poorly, inhumanely. So badly, as a matter of fact, that no sober Christian could bear. That is, nobody who follows the Christian faith, no decent person should be able to stand the tortures inflicted upon these people being accused of witchcraft and then killed, brutally killed. The justices also had trials of cruel mockings. That is, they're mocking these women. There's no justice here. Which is more, considering what a people for religion. Again, this man is like, these people are supposed to be really religious. They're supposed to be really tight with God. He says, considering what a people for religion, and he says here, I mean, the profession of it. That is, they talk a good game, but their practice of religion is extremely poor. We have been, those that suffered, being many of them church members, and most of them unspotted in their conversation, until their adversary, the devil, took up this method of accusing them. So at the very end, this guy is saying the Salem witch trials, right? This whole mess, townspeople are part of, kids are a part of, the justices are a part of, the church members are a part of, the church elders are a part of. All of this is of the devil. They are not doing God's work. They are doing the devil's work. That's a pretty serious accusation, right? Okay. So now let's look briefly at the questions. What aspects of this document may have caused the Puritans to want to burn it, right? So if I'm answering this question, I'm going to look back through the document and I'm going to see all of the criticisms that Mr. Carey heaps upon the Puritans. Now, it's throughout the document, right? So we could talk quite a bit about this from the time that Mr. Hale basically tricks Mr. Carey into meeting with the accusers, who then accuse his wife. We could talk about the fact that these women are being manhandled. The women who are being accused are being manhandled, right? Having their hands held and other things, which is actually super against the Puritan code of conduct. Talk about that, right? We could definitely talk about the fact that this narrative very clearly enumerates the way that this is an injustice. The mock nature of the trials, the fact that these girls didn't even know his wife and had to ask her name and then accused her, and the fact that the Puritans, this whole narrative, the fact that the Puritans completely got caught up in the hysteria, never really questioned the girls nor the Native American enslaved people. And let's recall that one of these enslaved Native Americans was also being accused of witchcraft, and that the justices are not pursuing justice at all. The biggest part of the reason why the Puritans may have burned this document is not only does it give a cohesive narrative about the injustices over and over again, but it specifically states that this is a cruel process, a miscarriage of justice. Not only that, but these witch trials are not from God. No, they are from the devil. Now let's remember, if we put this into context, that people in this era very much believed the devil was real and very much believed that witches were real. I mean, witchcraft as a religion is real, but that these women were possessed of the devil or sleeping with the devil and able to do horrible things. This is a reality to these people. Okay. So for this man to say, basically, these Puritans have been possessed by the devil, have been inspired by the devil, not God. They are acting on behalf of the devil, even though they claim to be acting on behalf of God. That's a huge accusation. Okay? So if I were answering this question, I would for sure talk about the accusations of the husband in the final paragraph and details throughout the document. And then the second question is, what is this author's opinion of the leaders of the colony and those that presided over the trials? It's pretty obvious that the author has a very poor opinion of the leaders of the colony and those that presided over the trials. Okay? And once again, you would go and you would pick up specific pieces of the document, right? The duplicity of Mr. Hale. The fact that the justices are sitting in the other room of that alehouse waiting for an accusation. The fact that it doesn't matter what evidence is presented, the justices already have determined that all of these people accused of witchcraft are guilty, right? And so we would take specific pieces from the trial. Along with this, I would always also say that, the author has a negative opinion over the leaders of the Massachusetts colony, right? But a positive opinion of the leader of the New York colony, the governor here, right? And I would choose specific pieces to talk about to uphold my opinion that this author has a poor opinion of the leaders of the Massachusetts colony and a higher opinion, for example, of New York, right? And for example, could go up here, I did easily perceive which way the rest would go. For the same evidence that served for one would serve for all the rest, right? So he knows his wife is in extreme danger. He knows they don't need real evidence, that everybody is going to be condemned, and he's correct about that. I would talk about, how the leaders kept the shackles on his wife, and they wouldn't take them off, etc., etc. Now, that's kind of the end of this little going over this and thinking about ways to answer it. So you need to read the questions, right? Then read the document, then think about how you would answer the questions, and then read the document again. Now, it's important to try to really understand the document, and that might take a couple of readings through because people back then don't speak like we speak. As a matter of fact, these have been translated to kind of help you understand, right? If we go back to like Salem, Massachusetts in the late 17th century, we're not going to understand a word people are saying, even though it's English. And they're not going to understand us either. And honestly, we'd all be accused of witchcraft, and that would be bad. Okay? But I also want to point out, right? It's very easy to make a good guy, bad guy analysis based upon this document because clearly, as 21st century people, we're pretty sympathetic to this poor woman who has been accused and her husband. And to all the other people that are accused of witchcraft, literally tortured and put to death. But this is a different worldview, a different time. It's easy to have quite a bit of empathy for these people that are falsely accused and executed. And there has been a lot of historical work done on why these young girls would have started this. What's their psychological state? What is going on here, right? We can't ever fully know. On our 21st century minds, it seems pretty dubious that, the devil was controlling these young girls. This is actually, if you've read in your textbook, right, and in the class, this is actually a time of upheaval and change in Salem, Massachusetts. Many people don't like change, right? There's a scapegoating effect going on here. But people at the time, many of them would not have seen that. These girls, on one level, may have really truly believed they were cursed. When, did they start out pretending and then it became real to them? Did something happen where they believed they had a real experience? Did they just make stuff up as sociopaths? It's complicated. We can't actually ever fully know. What we can look at, though, are the documents left behind, first person accounts, witnesses' accounts, to piece together really a tragic story in early American history, and hopefully to understand how to prevent anything like this from happening again. All right, thank you.